I've recently been playing a new game called Mordhau a lot. It's a sublime multiplayer brawler that is so well made and incredibly addictive with its simple yet intricate combat system, which takes place with brutally visceral detail, but still manages to carry itself with a wonderful, tongue-in-cheek comical manner conveyed through the vocal dialogue that I could sing its praises in more great detail for quite a while. And maybe I will sometime. But today, I want to discuss a contentious topic regarding the game's lack of female characters, and whether they should be included or not. As I write this, I'm already aware, or have heard, that the devs have been working on and possibly intend to include female characters post-release. Nonetheless, they have still bizarrely come under fire for not including them at launch, despite the game's setting, theme, and context clearly being that which is a naturally male-dominated domain. Those decrying this lack of choice cite the usual reasons: inclusivity and player choice, the latter being a reasonable concern in most cases where one is able to create and customize their own in-game avatar. I do believe, however, that the inclusion of females into this game is not a desirable goal, and I will explain why I think this. Now would typically be the point in the commentary where I preface my overall feelings towards sexism and misogyny in a vain attempt at alleviating the inevitable forthcoming accusations of being labelled those things, simply by virtue of what I've already said and choosing to discuss it publicly. But I'm not going to do that. It's already quite obvious how fruitless such clarifications are when dealing with individuals who will only see and hear nothing more than what the worldview through which they filter all incoming information allows them. If reason, open-mindedness, and common sense are so lacking and underdeveloped within those individuals that they are unable to discern my stance on said matters after hearing my words, then quite frankly, that is their problem. I will not entertain them by clarifying anything said that might be considered even minutely controversial. I don't regard this discussion as controversial. I regard it as painfully apparent and somewhat mundane, and we should never be made to feel that something so fundamentally natural as gender differences and belonging cannot be discussed openly, without hesitation, when necessary. And the sheer notion of such is laughably ridiculous. Now then, on to my reasons proper, which are actually quite simple. A common argument you may hear from others who are against the inclusion of female characters in Mordhau is that of historical accuracy. Women were simply not to be found on the battlefield, which is true, bar the obvious few exceptions, as with all things when looking at the big picture. I don't care much for this reasoning personally, as historical accuracy was never a selling point for me, and I don't have knowledge of the time period beyond the basics anyway. Warfare has always been a man's game, determined as such by how nature has defined our biology, especially true when speaking of old-fashioned, in-your-face melee warfare. We're simply better suited to it when comparing to females. A rather grim gift to be bestowed by nature, but nonetheless our psychologies are hardwired to derive a form of desire toward this, to help ease the often fatal burden. Having a female combatant on such a battlefield would certainly be unusual, if not slightly jarring, considering feminine nature and biology does not typically drive them to be present or as effective in such environments as men. But I wouldn't really care much personally. It's a computer game, and it certainly doesn't seem to be striving for the ultra-realism that the historical accuracy arguers would state in their reasoning. Plus, the character models would be obscured under their armor most of the time, I would hope. Although I will admit that in a setting being very male-centric, female character models alone would be slightly detracting from the game's atmosphere, but not enough to compromise it for me. That being said, much of Mordhau's atmosphere and grim charm comes not just from the look of the characters, the armor, the weapons, maps, and art design, but also the dialogue that is spoken by the avatars, and the manner in which they speak it in a melee battlefield setting. And it is here where I believe the addition of females, specifically the vocalizations for them, will compromise the game's setting and overall feeling, and negatively impact its deeply immersive and slightly absurd comical quality afforded by the presence of only males. As well as having thoroughly addicting, engaging, and polished gameplay that is simple to grasp, yet has an enormous skill ceiling of nuanced technicality to embrace and master, Mordhau supports all of this with a detailed atmosphere to match by means of the aforementioned. But it also manages this without taking itself too seriously, at all, sometimes. When making a character and giving them a voice, there are various different personality types to choose from, based upon the kind of characters and accents you might expect to hear from a Monty Python-esque interpretation of the time period the game is set in. Few of these lines are actually serious. Many are quips and one-liners played for laughs, spoken with very exaggerated accents that have been deliberately chosen with the character's personality and gender in mind, befitting of what the male mind might concoct in those moments in what is a very male environment, in all its ridiculous extremes and gallows humour. Here are some examples of such.
I've had rougher times in a brothel!
No, you point it this way, you idiot.
Your comical timing is genius, sir! You get the better of me! Ha! Unlikely!
You ain't nothing but a dunderhead bastard son of a codpiece!
Oh shit, sorry!
As silly as some, or many of them sound, there is no denying that they retain a form of believability on account of their delivery, but most importantly because it's males saying them. If we were to swap the genders, and keep the voice dialogue the same with a similar delivery to match, I believe hearing such lines delivered from a female would for the most part come off as contrived, and thus lacking the vital believability. Why do I think this is? Well, because if we look past their unnatural presence in this environment, females generally lack the kind of testosterone-fueled energy, ego, pride, recklessness, delusion, sense of camaraderie, and whatever else that are the prerequisites of one's personality to typically think of and say such lines. It's all very much banter, and banter is another domain of communication that has always been overwhelmingly male. The way men and women communicate with members of the same gender have always been very different depending on the social class. In the case of men below upper middle class, a typical social interaction amongst friends or familiar colleagues, predominantly when we're younger, is a constant barrage of light-hearted mockery, or, to put it more bluntly, piss-taking of one another. All done with an air of humour, most of the time. That's how men bond, you see, by constantly challenging each other to make sure our brains are sharp and that we're able to give as good as we get. If we go a little deeper into this behaviour, then this is a subtle way of always testing that when in trying times, we are fit and able to withstand the pressure and maintain our composure to bite back. Because men, by our nature, and of traditional social expectations, know that at some point we may be called upon to protect and defend and attack. So, we can't let ourselves get soft in that regard. It's a way of knowing whether the man who stands beside you in those moments is one you can really rely on. With this in mind, the humorous, whimsical manner that some personalities deliver their lines would sound forced and unnatural in a female tone. And the same for the upper-class snob voices, where the kind of banter spoken would at best just feel like she's trying to imitate what a male would say, without the innate undertone of gusto. It just wouldn't be fitting to the game's intended atmosphere at all, I think. Now let's have a listen to some of the more serious and grim vocal deliveries within the game.
those bastards!
Your death will not be painless.
You will not escape my wrath!
They're all over us! Let's get out of here!
There is no question that female suffering is taken with more seriousness and imperative than male suffering within our societies, which in itself is a whole other discussion. But staying with the topic at hand, I think most of us can agree to that observation. I can't say whether this difference in concern was as pronounced back in the time period the game is set in as it is now, but I believe there has always been something innate within us, in males especially, that finds the idea of female suffering quite intolerable, even unbearable. With all that said, hearing a higher-pitched feminine voice scream out in agony as her limbs are lopped off, or desperately cry out for help as she runs for her life, is something that our psychologies struggle not to take seriously. It's perversely funny to see a male avatar with the flesh wound perk, and this is a perk that lets you live for 6 more seconds after taking a fatal wound, hop on his last leg while screaming to chase you down or try to beat you to death with his stump or last remaining arm. Seeing and hearing that from a female just wouldn't have the same charm. Alongside that are the battle cries, of which they would just be far less believable and impressive as their male counterparts. Nor would a female typically have the rampaging testosterone within them to inspire such bloodthirsty cries. The ultimate point being that with the general psychology behind these actions now explained, the presence of feminine energy would very subtly, yet dramatically, change the entire feel of the game's intended atmosphere towards a less believable and subconsciously more serious experience for the players, who will of course be majority male, and thus corrupt the grim, chivalrous fun the game currently delivers so successfully. Whether we like it or not, both genders profoundly affect one another just by sheer knowledge and feeling of their presence. Men and women have distinct energies, very different in many ways. That changes our behavior and attitude in a given situation. Such is our nature. I believe that one of Mordhau's greatest strengths is its distinctively male environment, which fosters the kind of behavior from players that further bolsters its intended experience, and by extension, its immersion. It may sound like a little thing in the grand scheme of things, but as we all come to learn later in life, the little things have a big impact in the end, especially for longevity. And so I hope the developers consider this, and leave the game as is, male avatars only, for the good of the whole experience in the short and long term. So to conclude, and wrap this all up, I believe females should not be added into the game on account of the setting being one that is very much a male-centric domain, and is enhanced by this fact for the reasons stated. Females, by their nature, bring an unavoidably distinct feeling and energy into the mix that would, in this case, compromise the atmosphere, immersion, and believability, all affecting a player's subconscious perception of the game, for the worse. There has been a compromise suggested that females could be added, but with a toggle in the game's options that allows the player to view them all as male from their perspective, if they wish. This is quite a good compromise, the best of both worlds, in a sense. But I think most players will simply not toggle this, as they would not have consciously considered the impact of feminine nature within the game, unless they possess adequate introspection to have thought about it prior. And by then, their experience and perception will have already been affected, without them even knowing it. Before I end the video, there is one last inevitable argument from those that will dislike what I've had to say, which I would like to preemptively address quickly, as well as hopefully add a little common sense perspective to that matter. I'm not saying this for them, mind you. I said at the beginning of the video, there is nothing I can rationalize to the closed-minded. I'm saying this for those neutral parties who will read their words with some uncertainty. Some people will decry the idea of a male-only environment, in any aspect of life, as being somehow inherently bad or sexist. This is absolutely bonkers and makes no sense. What is wrong with having a male-only environment? There is nothing wrong with it, as any reasonable person already knows. And those who state anything male-only is automatically bad without question are clearly showing their own disdain and sexism towards the male gender. Please do not buy into the idea that a male-only environment is bad. It has always been imperative for our social health and bonding to have areas and domains that cater to the needs of a specific sex. By means of our nature, we are more inclined towards, and are better at, different activities and pursuits. So we have traditionally constructed our societies in support of this obvious fact. Men need and deserve a place for themselves to learn from each other the ways of their gender, and be more free in their interactions amongst those who are naturally more relatable and understanding to them. The same applies to women-only domains, of course. As much as they would like to claim otherwise, women do not know what it is like to be a man, and how to be fulfilled as a man in a deeper sense, and they never will. They struggle to understand so many of our nuances, just as we struggle to understand theirs. Mordhau is a male's game set in a male's world, where we may interact as such. And that is a wonderful, necessary thing, especially in a modern world that is less and less catering to the needs and energy of men, and instead forces more feminine activities upon us as the norm. If we are ever made to feel apologetic or ashamed or evasive of having our own spaces to come together and bond in a way that is catered towards our very natures, then the stability of society is in trouble.